All right, let's crack open this case file. Tonight, we're digging into the long, simmering diplomatic war between Canada and Venezuela's Nicolás Maduro. And look, this wasn't just some political spat. This was a multi-year, full-blown investigation that went from harsh words to international criminal charges. So let's get into the evidence.
So, where did it all start? Right here. In 2019, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau drops this bombshell. A brutal dictator. He didn't hedge, he didn't hold back. That one phrase wasn't just rhetoric. It was the official start of the investigation. The target was identified, the motive was clear, and Canada drew a line in the sand.
But dictator, well, that's a political label. The real legal firepower was this word, usurper. See, since way back in May 2018, Canada's official position was that they didn't even recognize Maduro as president. In their eyes, he wasn't just a leader they disagreed with, he was illegally holding power. This one word, this legal definition, it became the bedrock for everything that was about to happen.
Okay, so the case is open. They've got their motive, they've got their legal foundation. Now, how do they start to build their case and go after their target?
Enter the Lima Group. Now, this wasn't just some friendly international club. This was Canada's chosen weapon. As one of the leaders of this 14-nation coalition, Canada pushed for a policy of, and I'm quoting here, international strangulation. The goal was simple and pretty brutal. Squeeze the Maduro regime from all sides, cut off its legitimacy, and just force it to collapse. This was diplomacy as an instrument of pure, unrelenting pressure.
But here's the thing about diplomatic pressure. Sometimes it's not enough. So Canada decided to escalate. They were ready to take this case out of the back rooms and into the courtroom. The political fight was about to become a formal charge sheet.
And you know, this wasn't a rash decision. It was a slow, calculated build. You can see the steps right here. It kicks off in May 2018 with a usurper declaration. Then, just a few months later, in September, Canada leads a historic charge, getting 6 nations to refer Maduro to the International Criminal Court. I mean, think about that. They're asking the world's highest court to investigate a sitting head of state. Then, by January 2019, they get the G7, the big guns, to issue an ultimatum calling his whole inauguration a sham. Step by step, they built their case.
So what was in that referral to the court? Well, we're not talking about small stuff. The Canadian-led dossier was loaded with the most serious charges you can make under international law. They alleged crimes against humanity, state-sponsored torture, and extrajudicial killings. They argued these weren't just random acts, but tools the regime used to cling to power. The political case file was now officially a criminal one.
And then, the lead investigator on the case changes. In March of 2025, a new Prime Minister, Mark Carney, takes over in Ottawa. And if you thought the policy was aggressive before, well, he decided to turn the heat up way up. The whole investigation was about to go into overdrive.
Just look at the change in language. It tells you everything. Under Trudeau, the term was brutal dictator. That's a political problem, right? Under Carney, it becomes criminal mafia. That is a totally different ballgame. You might negotiate with a dictator. You don't negotiate with a mafia. You dismantle it. This wasn't just a word choice. It was a fundamental change in strategy.
And Carney made it perfectly clear. He said the regime had, quote, ceased to be a government and become a mafia. Wow. In that one sentence, the entire game changed. From Canada's perspective, this was no longer a flawed government. It was an organized crime syndicate. Diplomacy was out, law enforcement tactics were in.
So, if you're going to reclassify your target as a mafia, what's your next move? You don't send diplomats, you go after the key players. You draw up a list.
The first wave of action was swift. 14 senior officials in the Maduro regime. And this was no slap on the wrist. Canada moved to freeze their assets, hitting them right where it hurts, the wallet. This was a direct financial strike aimed at the very people propping the whole system up.
And these targets weren't chosen at random. This was a strategic move to destabilize the pillars of Maduro's power. You've got the head of the Supreme Court, Carolina Rodriguez, for allegedly shredding the Constitution, an election official, Rosa Bagil, for her role in stealing the 2024 election, and the chief of the National Guard, Antonio Jose Benavides Torres, for the brutal repression of students. Each sanction was tied to a specific charge, building the public case that this was, in fact, a criminal network.
And you know what? Eventually, Canada's hardline approach started to convince its biggest allies.
The G7 ended up adopting that exact same criminal framework. Their ultimatum described Maduro's regime as a criminal extension of power through state terror. And just like that, Canada's private case file had gone global.
So as we close this case file, what are we left with? It's pretty clear that Canada built its case methodically, escalating from political labels to international charges to direct financial sanctions, treating an entire state like a criminal organization. It's a powerful and, you could argue, an effective strategy. But it leaves you with one big, lingering question. When diplomacy becomes a weapon, where does the conflict...
Hey everyone, and welcome. Have you ever stopped to think about how a public enemy is really made? You know, it might not be as organic as you think. Today, we're going to deconstruct what one source calls a media playbook, a set of tactics allegedly used to frame a leader as a villain. So, let's dive right in.
So yeah, how does it actually happen? Is it just about reporting the facts as they come, or is there something more deliberate going on? A kind of formula with specific tactics designed to shape not just what we think, but how we think about a person or a country.
For this explainer, we're cracking open a pretty fascinating document. It's called Dossier 2, the Canadian Media's Tyrant Playbook. Now, we're going to use this as our source material to see what it claims about how a specific media narrative was built around Venezuela's leader, Nicolás Maduro. Okay, so the dossier kicks things off by outlining its first big tactic, a frame it calls the dreary tyrant. And it specifically digs into how, in its view, outlets like CBC News helped build this exact image. A huge piece of this, according to the dossier, was personal mockery. The document points out how often Maduro's past as a bus driver was brought up. And the goal, as the source alleges, wasn't just to state a fact, it was to frame him as, simple, kind of out of his league. The dossier really boils down the alleged effect with this quote right here, saying the goal was to portray him as an unrefined thug holding a sophisticated nation hostage. You can see how language like that is meant to delegitimize someone right from the get-go. And the source document gets really specific here. It doesn't just make a vague claim. It links this narrative tactic directly to CBC News anchors and columnists, even naming Neil MacDonald as someone who often used this kind of framing. From there, the narrative just keeps building. The next piece of this dreary tyrant tactic, according to the dossier, was a heavy focus on hunger, specifically through what it calls starvation documentaries.
Now this is where it gets really interesting. The dossier argues that these stories weren't just reporting on food shortages. It claims they deliberately framed food as a political weapon, even accusing Maduro of intentionally starving his own people just to get votes.
And again, the dossier points fingers at specific programs. It cites recurring segments on CBC's main news program, The National, and also the show About That, as being the main drivers of this particular storyline.
All right, let's switch gears to the second major tactic laid out in this document. This one is called the criminal enterprise, and the dossier claims this particular frame was pushed mostly in reporting from CTV and Global News. So this tactic allegedly started with what the document calls lockstep reporting on Canadian sanctions. The claim is that when the government announced sanctions back in 2025, the media coverage pretty much presented them as a moral necessity, without much room for any other viewpoint.
And that's really the key point here. The source argues that there was no real debate shown, no balanced reporting. The narrative, as the dossier puts it, was that Maduro was treated as a narco-terrorist by default. His criminality was just assumed from the start, not something that needed to be proven.
And the dossier connects this reporting style directly to CTV News and its coverage of those 2025 sanctions. It suggests this was a key moment where this criminal by default idea really took hold.
To really hammer home this criminal enterprise frame, the dossier says the next step was using these really visceral, emotional investigative reports, and it specifically points to reporting on the El Helicoide prison in Caracas.
The source uses some really powerful language to describe the alleged impact of these stories. It says it was all about broadcasting the horror stories of his death squads to Canadian audiences, which you can imagine would create a pretty potent and damning emotional picture.
And the document is clear on who it's talking about. It identifies Global News as the outlet behind these specials, which allegedly branded the prison as Maduro's torture palace.
So we've seen the two main tactics the dossier lays out. But now let's zoom out and look at the big picture, the overarching frame that the source claims tied this whole thing together. And that's this idea of the media acting as a moral judge.
The dossier actually comes up with a term for this, moral leader. It argues that media coverage constantly painted Canada's actions, like its sanctions and its diplomacy, as totally righteous and good. According to this document, there was basically no space to even question if this was the right thing to do.
Now this is the part that's really fascinating. Check out the binary that this allegedly created. According to the dossier's analysis, you were either on the side of the moral leader, which was Canada's official stance, or you got labeled a regime apologist. The source argues this framing just completely shut down any kind of nuance or real debate.
So after all that, what's the big takeaway from this document? What does this playbook actually look like when you strip it all down? Let's quickly recap the blueprint as the dossier presents it.
According to this source, the playbook is basically a three-step process. First, you use personal mockery to make the leader seem illegitimate. Second, you establish their criminality as a given, an unquestioned fact. And third, you frame the whole conflict as a simple good versus evil story, with your side being the good guy.
So there you have it. The dossier lays out a really compelling and definitely controversial breakdown of one alleged media strategy. And that leads me with a question for you. As you look at the news today, what kind of narrative playbooks do you see being used?
For years, Canadian foreign policy had a laser focus on one person, Nicolás Maduro. The message was loud, it was clear, it was unwavering. And then, almost overnight, someone hit the mute button. So let's open up this dossier and figure out what on earth happened. So this is the big mystery, right? You spend years and a ton of political capital on a very loud, very public campaign to get rid of a leader. And then, the moment it actually happens, you get radio silence. It's a stunning reversal, and it absolutely demands an explanation. Okay, so let's set the scene. The date is January 3rd, 2026. The news breaks, and it's something that should have been a mission-accomplished moment for Canadian diplomacy. But the reaction out of Ottawa? It was anything but a celebration. In fact, it was weirdly quiet. And here's where it gets really interesting. This is the official statement. The language is so sterile. It's legalistic, it's cautious. Exercise restraint. Uphold international law. Wait, what? This sounds more like a statement about a minor border dispute, not the removal of a man Canada had spent years calling a monster. So how in the world did we get from a years-long crusade to this quiet little call for legal process? Well, to really get why that pivot is so jarring, we have to understand the policy that came before it. Let's rewind the tape. So, for the better part of a decade, Canada's official stance wasn't just critical. It was outright hostile. We're talking about the government using its full diplomatic and rhetorical power to completely isolate and delegitimize the Maduro regime. And this wasn't just some passing phase. It was a sustained campaign, year after year. From 2019 on, Canada's position was simple. Maduro is an illegitimate usurper, period. By 2021, they're refusing to recognize his presidency at all. This hard line just continues all the way through 2024. The foundation for every single action was that this guy had to go. And you can't get much clearer than this. This quote from Prime Minister Trudeau himself really shows you the moral certainty of the policy. This wasn't just a diplomatic tiff. The language here frames Maduro not as a political rival, but as a top-tier criminal, a brutal dictator committing crimes against humanity. There's no gray area in a statement like that. Now, you might think that when the government changed hands, maybe the policy would shift, but that is not what happened. The new administration under Prime Minister Mark Carney didn't just keep the policy. They cranked it up to 11. They doubled down. The key moment really comes in March of 2025. This is when the Carney government decides to escalate things in a big, big way. They move beyond just condemnation and start taking direct action. And the language they use here is absolutely crucial. They officially slapped the label of criminal regime on Maduro's government. Now, this wasn't just rhetoric anymore. This was the legal justification they needed for direct action, basically framing the government of Venezuela as a threat to global peace. And these sanctions were no joke. They went right for the top of Venezuela's power structure, the head of the Supreme Court, Carlos Rodriguez, and the head of the Electoral Council, Rosalba Gil. This was Canada taking a direct shot, trying to cripple the very institutions keeping Maduro in power. Okay, so all of that brings us right back to January 2026. Now that we've seen the history, the years of condemnation, the sanctions calling them a criminal regime, let's look again at that wild, abrupt reversal. This is where the contrast just becomes staggering. On one side, you have the language from less than a year before, brutally oppressive and criminal regime. On the other side, suddenly it's all about restraint and international law. I mean, the whiplash from that shift is just incredible. So the dossier we're digging through actually has a name for this massive contradiction. It calls it the gap. And it's not just about what the Canadian government said, it's about what it pointedly didn't say. Let's break down this gap. First, the U.S. pulls off an operation that achieves a goal Canada has publicly stated for years, and Ottawa says nothing. No thank you. Second, no congratulations to the U.S. president on getting it done. And third, the entire thing gets reframed as just a situation to monitor. A situation to monitor? That's not a victory lap, that's someone quietly backing out of the room. So we have to ask the question again, why the silence? After all those years of aggressive rhetoric, why the sudden caution? The dossier offers a pretty pointed analysis. And this is really the heart of it. According to this analysis, the sudden obsession with international law is a strategic move. It's a way for the Canadian government to create distance, to wash its hands of the messy reality of regime change, a reality that it spent years demanding.
I mean, that's the ultimate contradiction, isn't it? For years, the message was simple. Maduro is a criminal and he has got to go. But the second he's actually gone, the message suddenly gets complicated and full of appeals to legal process. So why the newfound appreciation for nuance only after the fact?
And that leaves us with one last big question. The dossier lays out this dramatic shift from absolute moral certainty to extreme political caution. So what truly changed in that moment?
Okay, so today we are diving deep into a really provocative dossier. It's called the 2026 Narrative Fraud. And inside, it tells a story of oil, a whole lot of power, and a major political flip-flop. We're going to walk through its claims step by step.
So where does this whole story start? Well, according to the source, it all kicks off with a number. And wow, it is a big one. $50 million. But this isn't a jackpot prize. No, this is a bounty.
A $50 million bounty for who, you ask? According to the U.S. government, the target was Nicolás Maduro. He was officially designated a fugitive, wanted for, and I quote, narco-terrorism. Now, the dossier goes even deeper, alleging that Maduro is the absolute kingpin of a massive criminal organization known as the Cartel of the Suns. We're talking about a global cocaine trafficking syndicate, so you can see these are some seriously heavy accusations, and they're really the bedrock of this entire story. And this is where things get really interesting. This is the central puzzle the dossier wants us to solve. For years, the Canadian government had no problem calling Maduro a dictator, but then, suddenly, after he's captured in January 2026, the language does a complete 180. All of a sudden, it's about restraint and international law. The big question is, why? Why the sudden change of heart?
So yeah, that's the multi-million-dollar question, isn't it? What on earth could explain such a massive and public flip-flop in their official stance?
Well, the dossier offers its first big clue, and it's a classic piece of advice. Follow the money. The argument here is pretty simple. If you want to understand the politics, you first have to understand the economics.
And when you follow the money, where does it lead? According to this document, it all boils down to one thing: oil. Specifically, a type of oil called Orinoco heavy crude. And the crucial part? It's the only direct global competitor to the heavy crude that comes out of Alberta, Canada.
And this chart just lays it out perfectly. It's a true head-to-head competition. You've got the exact same product, heavy crude, and they're both fighting for the exact same key market, the U.S. Gulf Coast. These guys are direct economic rivals. One's gain is the other's loss.
So for about a decade, the source claims Canada had a kind of secret weapon. They call it a sanction shield. Basically, with all those international sanctions on Venezuela, their oil was pretty much off the table. And that gave Canada a virtual monopoly, selling its heavy crude to that huge U.S. market. Okay, so you can see why the stakes here are absolutely massive for Canada. Just think about it. A free, U.S.-backed Venezuela could suddenly flood the market with its oil, and boom, the price of Canadian oil could just crash. And to make things worse, this would happen right before the huge USMCA trade review in July 2026. Canada's negotiating power? Gone. It's what the dossier calls a perfect economic storm.
But this isn't just about dollars and cents or barrels of oil. The dossier argues there's a whole other layer to this, a deep moral conflict.
It's the official government line versus a very, very personal story.
And to understand this moral side of the story, the source points us to one person in particular, Canada's conservative opposition leader, Pierre Poilievre. And here's the key detail. His wife, Anita, is a Venezuelan refugee. So for their family, this isn't some abstract foreign policy debate, it is real life.
And this really sets up two completely different ways of looking at the exact same event. On one hand, you have the government's official line focusing on things like international law and defending the sovereignty of, well, a narco-state. But then you have Poilievre's stance, as the dossier presents it, celebrating liberation, an idea that comes directly from his own family reality.
And that all boils down to this one really powerful idea that the source highlights. It's the argument that getting bogged down in legal process is a total failure when the freedom of millions of people is hanging in the balance. As they put it, process cannot come before liberation.
All right, so we've got the money angle and we've got the moral angle, but the dossier says, wait, there's one more piece to this puzzle, and it's what they call the political filter. The core claim here is that a powerful bias is twisting the entire official story that's being told in Canada.
And wow, this chart, it lays out what is probably the most explosive claim in the whole document. It alleges that for the Canadian establishment, their animosity towards the U.S. leader who actually captured Maduro is way, way higher than their animosity towards Maduro himself. The implication is pretty clear. They dislike the captor more than the dictator.
And according to the dossier, this alleged bias doesn't stop with the politicians. No, it bleeds right into the media. It claims outlets are deliberately ignoring the celebrations of the Venezuelan community in Canada, and instead they're spinning poorly of support for the capture to make him look dangerous.
Okay, so how does it all fit together? The dossier takes all these threads, the puzzling reaction, the economic threat, the moral divide, the political bias, and weaves them all together to reach its final verdict. This slide really connects all the dots for us. It's like a chain of events. You start with that weird, puzzling reaction from the government. The motive? A threatened oil monopoly. That motive is then seen through this powerful filter of political bias. And the final result of all that is what the dossier calls the narrative fraud.
And all of that leads us right here to the dossier's final and, frankly, pretty damning conclusion. By putting an oil monopoly and a political grudge ahead of human freedom, it declares that the Canadian establishment has put itself firmly on the wrong side of history.
So there you have it. The source lays out this incredible story where oil, power, and politics all just collide in this critical moment. And it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? When all of these massive forces crash into each other, what, or maybe who, is the one that ultimately gets lost in the shuffle?